All right, guys, what do you guys think? Should we kick it off?
Well, if Dave's here, yeah. Just make sure we haven't lost the speaker.
All right. Okay, well, greeting everyone, and welcome to the NYC Complexity Lounge. We're a meetup where we gather to talk about all things related to complexity and complex adaptive systems. And I'm Jocko Selberg, and in one of those floating boxes is the lovely and talented Barbara Frontera. And together we co-host this lounge. Before we kick it off, I want to go through some ground rules, or perhaps they're ground heuristics, I don't know, but we will be recording this session for all of you that have been filling the chat boxes. So if you do not wish to be recorded, please make sure that your camera and your microphone are turned off. We also ask that you please keep the chat activity to a minimum during the presentation, just because they tend to fill up very, very quickly. After Dave's talk, we'll have a question and answer period, and you can either raise your hand or send your questions directly to Barbara via the chat. So she'll be handling all of the chatting, questioning, and stuff like that. The recording will be posted on our Vimeo page on our NYC Complexity Lounge, which is on Vimeo, and the link is in the meetup page. In the next couple of days, we should get it up, and that is where you'll find all of our past videos from the lounge. Our guest today is Dave Snowden. Dave is the founder and chief scientific officer at the Cynefin company, formerly known as Cognitive Edge, and the founder and director of the Center for Applied Complexity at the University of Wales. His work has been focused on looking at complex issues relating to strategy and organizational decision-making. He has pioneered science-based approaches to complex organizational issues, drawing from the likes of anthropology, neuroscience, and complex adaptive systems theory. Today, Dave will be discussing his latest thoughts on the application of constructor theory in complex systems, as well as the latest iterations of the Cynefin framework and whatever else is on his mind. So please join us in welcoming Dave to bring our first year of the virtual meetup to the close. So Dave, welcome to the lounge.
Hi. It's nice to be here as a speaker as well as a participant. So I don't know whether Chris Matz is here to reciprocate my listening to him the last time round, but we'll see where we go from there. I want to really talk about three things, and the intention is to talk about each of them, then leave an opportunity for question discussion and then move on, rather than do it in one concentrating batch, right? Some of you will have noticed that the Cognitive Edge, we went through a rebranding exercise last week, and there's a brand new website up. The reason for that, the Cynefin company is deliberate, right? It's our strongest brand, and we've now got basically a whole bunch of people trying to abuse that name. So we're establishing kind of like, guys, we're the Cynefin company. So that there's that sort of message within that, right? But also it represents some other major changes which are going on. There are some very significant changes in the software, effectively in a complete new edition of the software, which is out this week, next week. And we'll set up a whole series of briefings for people on that. And some very exciting work we're doing with the indigenous communities worldwide. Some of you will have heard the webinars I've been doing with Tyson initially in terms of Australian Aboriginal work. We moved that onto the Pacific Islands, and now we've done Native America. So there's a whole body of initiatives around that. And that's also linked in with, if you haven't seen it, the webinar I did with Nora Bateson, which has had a very big take up, where we've been looking at the whole question of abduction, right? And I will come on to abduction as we go through this. But my intention today is not to focus on the sort of software and the other material and the stuff we've just done to go open source on all of the methods. So if you're not a member of the Cynefin.io wiki, please feel free to apply. Yeah, it's an application base, it's not completely open. But we made a move to make all of the methods actually open source, so we could get very significant participation in that. Now I'll come on to this when I talk about the second framework. But to give you an illustration, one of the methods we developed over the years is the triopticon, which is an approach to transdisciplinary work. And I'm just trying to type it in. helps with my spelling. Yeah. So I've just given you a link there, and that's actually an animation of the process that Colin Pink's produced. And it kind of like illustrates what happens when you go open source. You can build a much bigger community much faster in order to do more on it, right? So I may come back and reference that particular simulation later, but that gives you an idea. So as I say, for people who want, join the Cynefin Centre, join the Cynefin company, get involved in the wiki, and you'll see a whole bunch of new community-based activities sort of firing off now and over the new year. But my goal today is really to update on the three primary sense-making frameworks within the Cynefin family. So one is Cynefin, the other is Flexuous curves, and then the new one, which I'm working on at the moment, is the currently codenamed the Estuarine model, because the underlying metaphor is an estuary, right? And I'll come back to that at the end. That is going to have a Welsh name. There are actually 12 to 15 different Welsh words for estuary. It's a significant part of our land, all right? I mean, estuaries, you get a lot of them in Wales, all right? So we got lots of different words for it. So I've got a conference call with first language Welsh speakers next week to kind of like agree which is the most appropriate one. Unfortunately, most of them can be pronounced by the English with minimal coaching. So we're going to work on that one, at least not as hard as Cynefin. So what I'll do is I'll go through Cynefin, Flexuous curves, and then try and leave as much time as possible for the really new stuff, which is the whole concept of constructors and constraints and energy gradients. Yeah. Now, there's a basic principle here, and there are kind of like 2 or 3 fundamental principles of our approach to sense making. The first of which isn't fundamental, but it's worth making the point, is we use a hyphen, whereas Carl Weick doesn't, right? You'd be amazed about the disputes in academic circles over that. But it's now established as one of the 5 distinct schools of sense making. And that's kind of like the reference for that. So I define sense making as how can we make sense of the world so that we can act in it? And that's a key definition. It's an action orientated definition. I mean, we're an action research based organization anyway. And it carries with it the concept of sufficiency. So how do I know when I know enough to make certain types of decision? On the basis you can never have perfect knowledge or perfect information, yeah, in terms of the way that works. So that's what we mean by sense making. And the naturalizing prefix to it is basically to use natural science as what in complexity is called an enabling constraint. Now, there's quite a few people in systems thinking who get upset about this. We're not saying that you can apply a 19th century notion of science to social systems. What we're saying is there's more than enough in natural science which we can use to define what is or isn't possible. Right? So, for example, this goes back to Gary Klein and others. Klein argues there's no such thing as a cognitive bias. There are only cognitive heuristics. Yeah, on the basis that evolution doesn't tend to throw out things which have no utility. And if you look at so-called cognitive biases, they're all about reducing the energy cost of decision making. And in the round, they generally work out for the best. Yeah, so inattentional blindness, which is the one I always quote, which is the radiologists who do not see a picture of a gorilla, even though it's 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. You can see the evolutionary reason for that because it privileges fast decision making based on partial data scan, privilege on our most recent experiences. And for a hunter-gatherer type, culture, it turns out we were hunter-gatherers a lot longer than people thought. The so-called agricultural term turns out to be not so absolute. That sort of capability is really important. And the same is true if you're an executive in IBM, which I was. You don't have the time to get all the available data and make all the right decisions and do objective. You just don't have the time for it. So you have to find ways to make decisions much faster. So if we know that's the case, and we know that 83% of radiologists will not see an X-ray, we don't try and train them to perceive things better. We build systems which find the 17% before they talk with the 83%, so that we can find outliers and different ways of thinking. And that's how this naturalizing concept works. You say, this is something we know from natural science. which means it's been subject to peer review and replication of experimental data, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, we can take that as an absolute. I'll talk about this later as a counterfactual. It provides a constraint, and therefore we need to develop methods and tools which conform with that constraint. Yeah? And within that, building towards the final model, it's like the fact we know the human brain pays more attention to failure than it does to success. And we know that historically fairy stories tell stories of failure, not success. And the reason is avoidance of failure is a more successful evolutionary approach than imitation of success. And so if you follow that through, it's better to define, to create a sense of direction in an organization by agreeing what we don't want to be, rather than agreeing what we do want to be. And again, that's actually how fairy stories work. So again, this is this use of what we know from a whole body of knowledge and saying, well, we know that's the case, so why try and run in the face of it? Let's work with it rather than against it. And that's also where complexity theory comes in. So complexity theory for us is one of the sciences we use, and it's a pretty important one. And I coined and developed the term anthropocomplexity years ago for this, to basically argue that the study of complexity in human systems is different from the study of complexity in termite mounds and birds flocking. Because human beings have intentionality, they have multiple identities. They also have all sorts of things like the ability to be altruistic beyond family groups. So with human beings, you're dealing with another level of complexity on top of what you find in what we call computational complexity, which you'll see associated with Santa Fe. Yeah. So I'm just giving you a sort of general background on this. And we are really heavily emphasizing these days sense making as a concept, because complexity is about to hit the hype cycle. You can see that there's rumors that the big consultancy firms are now starting to adopt it. And when the big consultancy firms adopt something, all they do is take the new language and put it on the old methods. It's what Gartner famously called the hype cycle. So we can see some of that coming on with complexity at the moment. So that's kind of like a key principle number one, is that we see natural science as a constraint, but we don't see everything as being based on natural science. I'm quite proud of the fact that I think I'm the first person to get Derrida's philosophy used in popular management speak. I don't think anybody's managed that before, and I'm particularly proud of that, and I'll come on to that one in a minute. So we also draw heavily on Deleuze and Derrida and the humanities, all right, in terms of what we do. But ultimately, we want that natural science as a constraint. So that's kind of like principle number one. Principle number two is any sense-making framework, you must be able to draw it on the back of a table napkin from memory. All right, now that's a deeply pragmatic principle, because what it basically says is if you have to carry something around with you, it's not really for sense-making. If I can actually just get up and sketch something on a whiteboard and have a conversation with people, then it can be used practically for sense-making. When we do knowledge mapping, which is a big part of our method structure, we actually have a mnemonic called ASHANS, which stands for artifacts, skills, heuristics, experience, and natural talent. And the point is, because it's a mnemonic, you can hold it in your mind. You don't have to have a cue card or a checklist. So the general principle of sense-making is the ability effectively to spontaneously have a conversation with people, but to use sense-making frameworks in background and then make them available. So that's kind of like a key principle. The other thing about good sense-making frameworks is they're multi-layered. So you can understand them at one level intuitively, very quickly, without training. And one of the things I'm quite proud of, actually, if you actually do a Google search on Cynefin, all right, or Google Scholar, about 95% of the references you'll get are people who never even talked with me, but just picked up and used the model from papers. Yeah, and that is actually something I'm quite proud of, because that's one of the principles of sense making. You need something intuitive people can use. But then as they burrow more deeply into it, they can discover more and more layers. Yeah. Now, Cynefin is the most mature of the frameworks. So what I'll do is run through where we are with Cynefin and explain how that works. Yeah. And Cynefin, if you don't know, it was first formulated in its current form, the 5-domain form, about 22 years ago. It's why we did the birthday book last year. Budawine and his wife were involved in the editing of that. And there aren't many frameworks which survive that long, particularly when they change. And I'd argue one of the reasons Cynefin has survived is it wasn't a static framework created based on a one-off study. It was a set of concepts and practices which mutated and changed over time. So as I learned more, I changed the framework, and learning came from academic conversations as well as practice, or, what Mary calls pracademics, which is one of those phrases I'm not quite sure I like. I prefer something better. But a lot of us sort of fall into that category. Yeah. So the unresolved question on Cynefin until last year was the central domain. We knew the central domain was critical, but it never quite worked. It was sort of there as something, but it wasn't central. And what happened last year was the introduction of the concept of the apparatic domain, and that transformed Cynefin. That was the last unresolvable tension within the framework. So Cynefin is now more or less there and stable, and I don't see it undergoing any other major changes. Yeah, only minor changes from now on. So what I'll do is I'll run through Cynefin as we currently define it. And also this links in with the EU field guide. For the people who haven't seen the EU field guide, that's the reference, right? That's also really significant. It's entirely based on Cynefin, and it's the first time a major government body has produced a field guide entirely based on complexity theory. And there ain't any systems thinking in there, right? Which has upset all the right people, right? In terms of the way it works. So the simplest level of understanding Cynefin is what we call the 3+1 representation. And this is actually the closest to the raw science. So it basically argues you have three types of system: ordered systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems. Yeah? I mean, you can get into plasma and stuff like that if you want as well, but in human systems, that doesn't really apply. So ordered systems have a high level of constraints, so everything is predictable. Chaotic systems, and remember the word chaos is not used consistently between academic silos. It means different things in social science, from physics and so on. So you have to define your terms. It's not that anybody's right or wrong. It's just the language hasn't settled yet. So chaos in Cynefin is a state of no effective constraint. Yeah, not of no constraint, but of no effective constraints, which means the system is quasi-random. Yeah, which is why if you fall into it accidentally, your action is to create some sort of constraint so you can create some patterns so that you actually reduce the randomness. I'll come back to that when I talk about leadership. So chaos is no effective constraints, and a complex system, and here I'm using a phrase from Alicia Gerraro a lot. She famously said a complex system is like bramble bushes in a thicket. All right. And for those of us who go walking in the hills, particularly for those of us who go walking with doctors who don't like paths and keep diving us into thickets and bramble bushes, you'll know that they're actually quite difficult. Everything is entangled with everything else. Where I'm now talking about complexity is that it's a deeply entangled system. Everything is interthreaded and interwoven and connected in all sorts of different ways. And as you know, if you actually ever get into a thicket with bramble bushes, you tug one branch and something else comes out and hits you in unpredictable ways. So you know the roots are all separate, but you can't separate them, yeah, in terms of your action. And the more you allow them to become entangled without any degree of management control, the more uncertain your environment. And I just flag that up for a moment, because one of the things we're arguing for at the moment is deliberate entanglement. You know that a complex system is entangled, so design the entanglement so that you can actually use it. And I'll come on to a couple of methods for that in a minute. Yeah. So we have entangled systems, which is a type of enabling constraint. We have systems with no effective constraint, and we have systems with constraints which make them predictable. And that allows us to use a metaphor of solid, liquid, and gas. And again, we're doing a lot of work on how to explain Cynefin to executives without them having to get into all of the theory. So you can go straight into the metaphor. And if you think about it, solid, liquid, and gas, solid is order, liquid is complex, gas is chaos. Right? So it's something which is solid. You can just put it on even on an inclined plane with a reasonable coefficient of resistance, and it's fairly stable. Liquid, on the other hand, you have to contain, and containment is very difficult. And of course, gas is even more difficult to contain. And that also introduces the concept of a phase shift. Yeah. So if you all remember latent heat from school, if I heat water up to 100 degrees, it doesn't become steam until I put more energy into the system. And I was out walking last weekend, and I still remember we were walking down kind of big in the Brecon Beacons. And I remember saying, it's going to snow. I grew up in the country. You know it's going to snow because the atmosphere just warms up a little bit. Because actually latent heat is being thrown out as the liquid becomes a solid. Okay, so that introduces the concept of phase shifts with energy required to achieve a shift between states. Right, this is one of the big differences between our approach and Stacey's approach. And the Stacey matrix is, for Stacey, everything is on a continuum and it's based on perception. For Cynefin, actually the three dominant states have phase shifts between them with energy input or energy output as you make them move. Yeah? And of course, the boundary between order and chaos is a catastrophic foe, because if you assume that everything is ordered and it isn't, when it fails, the failure will be catastrophic. Yeah, and I've given lots of examples of IBM expense systems to illustrate that. Yeah? Now, that also allows us to introduce the concept of the triple point. And if you, again, going back to your high school physics, you'll know there's a balancing point between pressure and temperature, which is equiprobable whether a system can become solid, liquid, or gas. And in Cynefin, that's the central domain, the aporetic domain. Now, aporetic comes originally from the Greek. I was taught it in rhetoric in 1972. It's a technique for rhetoric as well. It's a state of deliberate ambiguity. Derrida, who we took the definition from, basically says if you know the answer to a question, it isn't a question, it's a process. The only valuable questions are questions which, if you ask them, nobody can answer them without thinking differently. Yeah? So the central domain is the aporetic domain, and if you actually check onto the wiki or the blog, you'll find a whole catalogue of physical aporia, aesthetic aporia, and linguistic aporia, ways to deliberately force people to stand back and think again before they take action. Yeah? So the 3+1 version of Cynefin basically says order, complex, chaos, and aporetic. Yeah, and if you actually now look into the methods, you'll find the method of creating it is called 3 points, not 4 points, because it emphasizes those spaces. And we also say, faced with a crisis, you move things into the aporetic domain. In the field guide, this is called the aporetic turn. Yeah, so you move things into the aporetic domain, you don't try and resolve the problem. So I'll come to a key leadership principle on Cynefin, is the role of the leader is not to decide, but to coordinate. You'll actually find as you get more, I got promoted quite highly in IBM at the end, all right? The more you get promoted, the fewer decisions you actually get to make. And the more the customers you meet get angrier and angrier. It shows some sympathy for people at the top, because they never meet nice people anymore. They only meet problems, right? So the role of the leader is actually to coordinate, not to decide, because you just don't have enough information to make a decision. Not in a leadership role, all you can do is coordinate and link. The only exception to that is in a major crisis where you use your authority not to resolve the problem, but to make decisions which shift into the aporetic, i.e. which keep options open for longer. So the New Zealand Prime Minister did that quite well 2 years ago at the start of COVID. She actually broke the law to do total lockdown. It was deemed illegal after the event, but it gave her options. Whereas if you look in Britain, America, and Sweden, they waited till the evidence was overwhelming, by which time they had fewer and fewer options. Right? So a key principle of leadership within Cynefin is centralized coordination, distribute decision-making, except in a crisis where leaders make decisions to hold options open for longer. There's a body of stuff on that. Now, of course, if you're in the aporetic domain, then you can decide what things are ordered, what are complex, and what may become chaotic. And that's called the aporetic term, but I need to build back to that. So that's 3 + 1. And often these days, if I'm working executives, I'll hold Cynefin at that level. Now we can then dive down deeper. So we can split order into 2, clear and complicated. Now this isn't a phase shift boundary. It's basically, this is, more like a gradient. Yeah. So at one end of clear is the example I always give. In Britain, we drive on the left. In Germany, they drive on the right. That's a sense, categorize, respond. I'm in Britain. Britain is one of those countries which actually drives on the left. Therefore, I will drive on the left. Sense, categorize, respond. On the other hand, if it's complicated, I know that experts actually know the answer. So I can get experts to tell me what to do as long as I trust them. So that's sense, analyze, respond. Okay, so we introduce that then as a second level on top of the original 3. And then the next level down from that is where we draw the liminal line. It took me a long time to get it right. If you look at the early versions on the blog, some of the early ones were accidentally quite phallic, so I had to sort of get rid of those. So it's now one single green line. Remember the napkin test? So we get this effectively liminal zone. And to tell you where I got the idea on this, it's in the book. I was with my daughter in Naples. It was a business trip because we were looking at the anthropology of graffiti in Naples. The fact we also went to some nice restaurants and went to Herculeum is incidental, but it was a business trip, right? And the anthropology of graffiti in Naples is fascinating in its own right, by the way. So either way, we're in Naples and we went, both of us love Caravaggio. And I went to see the Seven Mercies, and all of a sudden I realized what I've been looking for in Cynefin. Because what Caravaggio does is to use light and shade to create this sense of transition. And in anthropology, that's called liminality. And by the way, that's another key aspect of naturalizing sense making. You know that art came before language in human evolution. And one of the reasons for art is to allow that inventiveness. By moving to a level of abstraction away from the concrete, we can make novel insights. A downside is it makes us prone to conspiracy theory. Yeah, it's an upside and downside thing. Yeah, that's actually what's called abduction. Yeah, an unusual or novel connection between things. So that actually also resolved a big problem with the Agile community, because Cynefin had both domains and dynamics, but the Agile community couldn't get 2 classification systems. So actually, by creating liminality, we got rid of the second one, although we still use dynamics. And it was possible to say, well, there's a whole body of methods and tools which sit in this liminal space between complex and complicated. So for those of you in the Agile community, this is where Scrum belongs. Because we kind of like know roughly what we want to do, but we've got to go through several iterations to sort out what it is. And there's a huge value in techniques which shift people from liminal complex to complicated, because then we get scalability. Right, so that transitionary domain, was actually far more effective. We didn't have to say this is boundary crossing, we say it sits there. And then that also leaves us freer to develop completely new methods in the complex domain. So one of the ones, for example, I'll use this as an illustration, and this is one of the ways we do entanglement, is use users trained to talk to IT people. And by popular demand, we will make that available as a course in January. It's a lot easier to train users to talk to IT people than train IT people to understand users. Right, so we put a user trained to talk to IT people together with a young programmer and an experienced systems architect. And we might have 10 of those trios and we throw them at a problem and see what they come up with. Now that's a complex systems approach because it's multiple parallel experiments. And everybody gets this wrong. First of all, they're not really experiments, they're probes. And they have to work in parallel, not in sequence. Because if you do one thing in sequence, that means it's liminal. It means you've already got the rough stuff worked out. Yeah? So that's a distinction. You also then get the liminal area of chaos. And that's one of the areas where we do a lot of work in software. So this is what's called a human sensor network. And we're doing work on this on peace and conflict resolution in the States and elsewhere using children as ethnographers. And that's where you present a situation to the whole of your workforce and they interpret it in real time. So you can see the dominant patterns and the outlier patterns. Remember I said finding the 17%? Well, the reason that is in chaos is that actually if all the agents can't speak to any of the other agents, you actually get a normal distribution from their response. The minute you connect people, you're in the tails of a Pareto distribution because the system starts to influence each other. So that concept of creating a space in which multiple agents independently interpret something, and then as a decision maker, I look at the result, is a very powerful technique, if nothing else, for hypothesis generation. And then the liminal line also allows us to split the central domain of aphoretic into truly aphoretic and plain confused, which actually also merges into that boundary between order and chaos. It's a bad place to be. If you're confused, that's one thing. If you're deliberately confused and you know it, that's something else again. There's a sort of intentionality aspect to that. And then this is kind of like the way accidents work, all right? So I could never find a way to draw Cynefin, even on a computer, without having the green line leave a little space in complicated. I just couldn't do it. So I just left it. And then I realized actually that's a critical area. So that's the area where you have experts who don't agree. Yeah, and if you look at the start of the pandemic, you see a lot of that. Epidemiology doesn't agree with behavioral scientists. And the work we've done on transdisciplinary work, which started in Whistler and completed actually completed in Whistler as well on design thinking, is where, in effect, what you're doing is to, and this is what the triopticon, which I sent you to the link, is about, is to create in a highly complex dance over 1 to 4 days between experts and semi-experts, in which they can either speak or listen, but they don't choose when they do that. It's orchestrated so that we can merge disciplines and resolve conflict between experts. And I'll leave you to look at that triopticon. And that's what we call the aphoretic turn field guide. You have a crisis, you move into aporia. Some stuff is complicated, nothing is ever clear. Yeah, all those experts who are telling you things, you now have to listen to, give them the resource. The experts compete, triopticon. You've got multiple hypotheses, you don't know what's right, complex, run parallel safe to fail probes. You don't think you've covered off all the hypotheses. You do mass sense and mass situational assessment, that's liminal chaotic, in order to do hypothesis generation. Okay? So effectively what's happened is the aphoretic domain, the central domain, has become the starting point, yeah, not an afterthought in terms of the way it works. Okay, so I've talked for about half an hour on that. And I've tried to show you the different layers of Cynefin, and we're deliberately introducing that. There are new videos, by the way. So you can have me doing 3+1, or you can have my daughter, who is now our lead anthropologist and shop steward for the staff, right? Who is doing her version of the old 5 version one. Yeah. And by the way, if you don't know, over the last year, we've roughly tripled the number of employees. And we've rebalanced the company. So we've got a lot of younger people and professional designers, and you'll see that in the quality of the output. So we got that rebalancing back in. Okay, so at that point, I'll stop and open to questions or comments or ideas around Cynefin framework. I've got 2 more frameworks to go through, but they won't take as long.
Okay, any questions? And, you know, let's make them questions in the beginning. We can get into the other stuff later.
I had a question.
Yes. Hi, Tiana. You
Shall I
can
just
raise
speak
your
up or-
virtual hand. Go ahead, Tiana.
All right. I'm kicking it off. I thought I heard you say that there's a difference between a probe versus an experiment as related to the hypothesis generation. Could you clarify that or tell me that's wrong?
No, it's actually very important. Sorry, to use an old joke, I would say it's a good question, but when I did that in Australia, I got told not to rate the question, but to answer it, right? So I'm sharing that still as much as possible so other people can use it. The point about a probe is it changes the space. the trouble is when you talk about experiments, people think they succeed or fail, and they get into this 19th century concept of science. Yeah. The reality is when you probe a complex system, the intervention changes the system anyway. So you don't necessarily expect the probes to succeed or fail in isolation, but in collective form, they may succeed or fail in different ways, and they will change the nature of the space. So that's why we talk about probes, not experiments. Any more?
Oh, good, Tiani?
Yeah,
Okay.
I just
So-
had one question.
Okay.
Just curious, Dave, you know, we talked in my world, everyone's talking about intersectionality all the time. How do you see intersectionality and the bramble bush in the thicket envelopment terminology of way of thinking about? They seem to be similar and overlapping. So I'm curious how you see these two terms relating to each other.
And I'm preferring to talk about entanglement and intersectionality. Because I think entanglement is a better word because it helps you understand what you have to do in the nature of the system. Right, so that would be the direction I would go. So, for example, one of the big things we say about Cynefin, again, this is a difference, is if you don't know it, Cynefin comes from a materialist perspective, or more specifically, new materialism. If you don't know new materialism, look at DeLanda or half a dozen feminist scholars, right? It's the concept the physical world exists, or as we try and say to postmodernists, reality exists, live with it, right? So Cynefin basically says there is, reality exists. That's one aspect. That's the systems, the ontology of it. The way we know things is not necessarily the way things are. And this goes back to Andy Clark. Human collective knowledge is part of our extended or distributed consciousness. So we have an epistemological overlay on reality. And then we have a perception thing, so that's phenomenology, so we have perception. Right? So we have how things are, how we know them, and how we perceive them. Now, there's a lot of complexity, and Ralph always did this, all right? Everything is about perception, because he was an extreme postmodernist. What Cynefin is also about is increasing the friction between reality, knowledge, and perception. So if you increase the friction, you increase alignment. You can't get full alignment. The more you get alignment, the better. So in a practical way, and I'll talk about the entanglement idea. One of the visions I've got, and we're working on this at the moment, is I should be able to take, well, not a clinical narcissist like Trump or our current prime minister, but I should be able to take somebody in a position of power who's become distanced from reality and interweave their timelines with the timelines of people who vote for them without any mediation, and create points of empathetic contact by which they see the world differently. Now I've talked about that a lot on the Indigenous group, and I've talked about it on the Nora Bateson group. So to me, that's why I think entanglement around points of empathetic coherence is what we're working on. So if we can increase that, you can get rid of path dependency in a human complex system. Right? And the problem with path dependency is it's what means people will not take global warming seriously until it's too late. So path dependency is negative as well as positive. So we're looking at ways to break that path dependency. And that does seem to be on this friction between reality and this focus on empathetic connections. Thanks for the question. Thanks for both questions. Any more?
You were talking about teaching executives or explaining the framework to executives. I want to branch off that in a slightly different direction, which is dealing with governmental agencies, because there especially there's this risk averse approach where they want to categorize, they want to analyze, they don't want to just do things. We have to spend millions on creating a report, bring in all the experts and explain what's going on. So I want to hear any tips you have about how to explain this framework to governmental agencies.
Okay, so good and bad news, all right? Good news is it's getting a lot easier. And I remember back in the 80s and 90s where those of us who quoted Ackoff and systems thinking were considered obscure academics. And then Hammer and Chamfrey published Re-Engineering the Corporation, and Senge published that awful book, Fifth Discipline. Sorry, it took us in completely the wrong direction. And all of a sudden, systems thinking is the way everybody does things. And that happened over 2-3 years, right? And we're seeing the same thing with complexity at the moment. And just to be clear, complexity is not systems thinking. It doesn't mean there isn't huge value in systems thinking. And I said this to Mike Jackson the other day. Yes, you guys dealt with complexity, but we also dealt with gravity before Newton. After Newton, we understood it better. So complexity gives us a science to understand complexity, and that's critical. Yeah? And you're starting to see that in government. So, I mean, I need to be careful here in what I say, but Cynefin is used at command level courses in every American military discipline. Marines, Army, Air, and we just got the Air Force on top of the Navy, right? And they don't have any problem with understanding it because, you know, of the VUCA concept in terms of the way they work. Health sector is the same now. And one of the things that COVID has done is make people realize that the world is inherently uncertain, and you've got to find ways of working without the sort of evidence base they're used to. So that's starting to build it in one sense. The other thing, and certainly the way I'm explaining it, is to talk, this is where I talk about the Frozen 2 strategy. And by the way, if anybody knows a good film critic who can help us, we plan to have a sort of Christmas webinar on Frozen 2 and complexity, but I need a really good film critic who can get into what script writers are about. And that's the Next Right Thing song in the middle of it. You know, and the real heroine of the Frozen series is actually the younger sister without the magic. And she basically sings, all I can do is do the next right thing and look away. Look again, now if she was Stuart Kampfman, she would call that the adjacent possible. Yeah, and people are starting to realize that. So we did big session, Nora Bates and I have been working with the NHS. And, you know, they're about to go through another series of changes. And what we basically said to them, and we said this to every agency we work with, is you don't want to use complexity for a major strategic project because you will not get it through. Yeah. There are two strategies. One is to tag it on to a strategic project as a method or tool that you use. Yeah. Remember I talked about hypothesis generation? So we're about to do some of that with the US Navy, right? So, and that's also creating a research experiment rather than a primary sale. So the way we got this into the NHS in Ireland was to run, and this is something you can look up on the website, it's called a 212. We basically said, look, this is an interesting set of ideas. They could be relevant. We'll work with you over 2 days to find the problems you can't solve with conventional techniques, and we'll set up some experimental programs using the new techniques. We'll run them for 2 to 3 months, and then we'll get together with the results. Did the same with the UN, right? And actually, the UN put some, they ended up with some heavyweight projects. In Northern Ireland, we had point of death narratives. In the UN, we were looking at the stuff around Chernobyl, and rehabilitation. So once they got into the experimental mode, they could put in really interesting projects, but they were experiments and they were research, not commitment. And that seems to work better. And, 10 years, 15 years later, both of those organizations are now doing a huge amount of complexity work. So I think the secret is, and this is one of the principles of complexity, is you start from where people are, not where you would want them to be. So if where they are is highly structured, evidence-based traditional consultancy, you start from there. You don't say you shouldn't be there. You accept that and you work with it. And my concern at the moment, to be honest, is people are jumping on the bandwagon. And it's like, we knew Agile was over when the big six adopted it. Because all they did was to take their old methods and tools and put the Agile branding on it. Nothing really changed. Yeah. And that's a sign when a market becomes commodified. And it's why I'm emphasizing sense making over complexity theory. Any more?
It's interesting, Dave, because for me, one of the interesting things about SenseMaker is around this question of expertise, right? Because what I find in a lot of the companies I talk to is that there's genuine expertise and then there's opinion. and they're often treated as though they're the same thing. And SenseMaker for me is a way to sort of get at what the genuine expertise might actually be.
It's also to present the differences. Yeah, I mean, some of the methods do this as well. So if an executive knows that their board and all their workforce assess a situation in the same 10-minute period, and this is the result, they can't avoid the differences. Yeah. And we do the same with methods. So the work we do on archetypes, for example, famous case, where we had 4 sets of archetypes: management archetypes of employees, employees archetypes of themselves, employees archetypes of managers, managers archetypes of themselves, all from the same narrative base. And you would think there were 4 different companies. And we put those illustrations up in a big room and dumped the executive in it. They didn't come out for 5 hours because they couldn't contest the result, because they'd been through the process themselves. So they had to accept that they saw things differently. And that's what you're always, it's that cognitive load, all right? And you're trying to avoid that. So that's another way that we actually break path dependency.
Anything else before Dave moves on? You can raise your little hand if you don't want to just speak out. Okay, I think that's it for now.
Okay,
Can you just,
yeah,
can you just remind us what path dependency means? Could you just remind us what that is?
Oh, it means that it's actually what the Cynefin word means, Archie. It's why it's such a good word for complexity. So Cynefin in English, it's habitat, but it doesn't mean that. It's much richer. It's the place of your multiple belongings. So it's a sense that there are many different paths which fundamentally influence who you are, but if you can't be aware, yeah, and therefore you have a path dependency on what went before. And you can see it in narrative form. So there's not a huge amount of genetic difference between, say, southern United States and Britain. But if you look at the political support in southern United States for things which in Europe wouldn't even be considered weird outlier opinions, but they dominate certain states. And just to depress you, I spent a whole week on Powder Mountain, and the most realistic scenario we came up with the states is called the Gilead scenario, in which red states become redder and blue states become bluer. Because people, basically blue cities in red states, people are going to migrate. With the legislation being passed, and then you get 2 nations, all right? And that's still a realistic scenario. And that's actually a type of pattern entrainment based on the stories which have come from mass participation over time. We're bound into the weft and the weave of the stories of the society which we're part of. And that's path dependency. And that's where we look at these empathetic links to break it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So the second framework, and this is, again, fairly mature now. This is where I took, this is, for those of you into Wardley mapping, this is the Cynefin framework, well, Cynefin family framework, which actually directly relates across to Wardley maps. Yeah. So this is me taking, and for those of you who don't know it, Wardley maps and Cynefin both have a common origin, yeah, in Brasso's eye space. So Simon and I started from that point, and I'm bringing a lot of Brasso's work back in at the moment, all right, into what we do, particularly concepts of abstraction and codification. So the Flexuous curves framework, and I'm just going to highlight this one. It basically takes market life cycle theory, so the classic sort of curve, yeah, of sort of, which goes through early adopters to late majority to laggards and so on. It takes Geoffrey Moore's version of that from Crossing the Chasm, which basically said, you get this initial demand and then it drops and then it picks up again. And if you haven't read Moore's Crossing the Chasm, it's probably one of the classics of marketing. And it's brilliant in that it actually predicted changes. It didn't just retrospectively describe changes, which is what nearly all other popular management books do. Yeah. So I took that together with the way Handy used S-curves, and I had the privilege to teach with Handy and Drucker, so that was hugely useful on this. And the way Flexuous curves works is it basically says there's a pattern. So any new or novel idea, you should, there's about 2.5% of the market will buy it. And by the way, I'm arguing this with venture capitalists at the moment, you shouldn't put money in, because actually, if you've got a good idea, there are people who will pay to develop it, and that's good for software. Because if you have to get people to pay you to develop it, you have to interact more with users. So what comes out of it is more resilient. If you've got a big chunk of venture capital money, you just develop what you think is right and hope it works. Yeah. So in that first period, effectively in software development, you sell to make. And you're only able to do that when the old way of thinking is coming to the end of its life cycle. Right, so kind of like the old way of thinking is coming to the end of its life cycle. It's getting tired. The old technology is getting tired, but it's so dominant that it's very difficult to break out of this early adopter phase into early majority, because the old idea is suppressing the new idea, even though the fact it's old is creating the space. Yeah? So we effectively, if you look at Flexuous curves, there's this zone where if you don't make a change, the industry dies. So I'll give you an illustration on that. IBM dominated the software industry and the hardware industry for years. And one of the reasons they did it is they did what was called an exaptive move. So they were the world market leaders in punch card machines to control industrial machines. And that gave them first mover advantage in computer programming. I learned to program on a punch card machine. I remember I had masters saying we'd have a job for life once we learned to use it, right? Modern equivalent is teaching kids Java programming. You'd be better teaching them anthropology. It would have more use downstream, right? He also made us do RSA stage 3 typing, which I'm internally grateful for, but I get totally frustrated that nobody else can type fast enough, on internet coordination. So either way, so that gave them first mover advantage. And that meant that as hardware became increasingly a commodity, they were protected from the price drops because they were the market leader. The phrase then was nobody gets fired for buying IBM. Yeah, so even if you had less good kit, people still go with IBM because it was a safer decision. And by the way, comes back to Jim's point, people in senior leadership positions will not take a risk even if they know it's right. Yeah, the modern equivalent is no fired for commissioning McKinsey's. Yeah, I commissioned McKinsey's twice to actually give me breathing space. I ignored the reports, but it gave me breathing space because the shareholders, oh, you're talking McKinsey's, that's wonderful. Yeah. So either way, so IBM, becomes a commodity. IBM is protected for that until all of a sudden it suffers a catastrophic failure. You can map this onto Cynefin as well. So basically, hardware becomes a commodity. IBM had the world's biggest ever loss of American corporate that year. And it was when Gersten was then brought in to rescue it. Yeah, so when the failure happens, it happens very quickly. And Microsoft took over. Because effectively, hardware didn't matter anymore. What mattered was software. And remember, Microsoft repurposed software IBM had paid them to develop. That was the irony of it. And then software became a commodity, and everything else. And Apple moved in and took over. So you see these cycles, where the old idea runs out of steam. Not until it's running out of steam is there space for novelty, but the old idea suppresses the novel idea, but you've got this difficult transition. And that's what Flexuous curves is about. And it's one of the things we can also do is we can trigger alerts to executive when they're meeting, when they're hitting those points. So there are two key points on Flexuous curves. One is called the exaptive point. So that's the point when the old idea is reaching its final stages and the new idea has reached a level of maturity that it can scale. And at that point, you have to move things across fast. And that's where you move from sell to make to sell, for example, if you're in software, because people are buying solutions, they're not being part of designing the solution. And then you get, and I had the privilege of working with Clayton Christensen when he was alive. So this is his original concept, which is called competence-induced failure. So you don't fail because you're incompetent, you fail because you're too competent at the old paradigm. And that's what happened to IBM and Microsoft and classically Kodak. In fact, it's sometimes known as the Kodak moment. Do you remember Kodak created digital photography? But they made so much money out of chemicals, even though they understood its potential, they didn't want to shift to it. So something more aggressive came in and took over. Now, this is also known as apex predator theory. It also means that you have different positions you can adopt. If you're at the early stages of maturity on a new idea, then your only strategy is to actually be a hyena, i.e. feed off the carrion. And you have to wait for that moment when you can do something new. Now, this is a complexity-based framework, challenges fundamentally people like Michael Porter's 5 forces, because it basically says strategy is temporal and contextual. Yeah, and the problem with most systems thinking models, and Porter is the classic systems thinking strategy, is they're context-free, is a context-specific world. So that's apex predator theory. It can be drawn with, two lines on a whiteboard. You can map that exactly across onto Wardley maps if you want. In fact, Wardley maps for me is an analyst tool, not an executive tool. So the power of Wardley maps is you need a good analyst to create it, then executives can use it, but an executive can't use it because they don't have the analytical capabilities to create it. So that's kind of like one of the differences. So that's the second framework. I've gone through that quickly, all right? Open up again to questions or comments before we get on to constructor theory, which is the current fun thing. All quiet?
Oh, come on. Don't be shy.
I'm happy to move on.
I have a not fully formed question, which is what I'm good at. How does stability play into this in terms of some of the curves that you're going through, or if you go even back into the Cynefin framework itself, is there anything special about the way that stability plays in any of the domains? Is it universal? How would you say, because usually when I hear it referred to, it's usually in a particular domain or something that's going on in a particular domain. Is there any way that we can generalize and abstract that, or is it not worth the energy to do that?
Yeah, no, it's actually an important part of Flexuous curves. So when IBM get that first mover advantage in computing, it's impossible to displace them until it becomes a commodity. Yes, so first mover advantage is key at the early stage. And then the market is very stable. It was all organized around IBM. I mean, at the mainframe, Amdahl was there. It's always worth having a sort of junior competitor who isn't very good. Yeah, so that makes it more realistic. But realistically, IBM just dominated the market. And I remember we had better software running on DEC alphas, and we could sell it until the IBM sales team turned up, and then we knew we were going to lose. Because basically they could sell, worse kit and worse software because they had that apex predator position. Yeah. So that's when the market is very stable. And what you look for is, and so you can see the same thing in Agile. So Scrum dominates the early stage. Yeah, not XP and not DSDM. And I was one of the founders of DSDM. And one of the reasons Scrum dominates it is at the right level of abstraction and codification to diffuse very quickly. And it created the model for all that came after, like SAFe. Okay? And now you can see Agile is hitting the commodification stage. I mean, yeah, the amount of people, I mean, Agile 2 nonsense and beyond Agile, and yeah, it's just ridiculous, all right? And that's the sign that something has reached a commodification phase, is everybody's trying to create something unique while actually not being remotely different. Oh God, you've got the ideas. Yeah, that's the way it works, all right? So that's when you introduce new stuff. So for example, design thinking, we're about to launch a major new approach on design thinking. We worked on it for 3 years. We worked on it with senior professors in MIT and Stanford and elsewhere. And the reason we're introducing that is if you look at what IDEO are doing, is they've commodified design thinking. Yeah, they've got courses and certificates, and it's now become completely standardized. So if you want to do something novel, this is a stable point, the instability is about to happen just when the system seems to be at its most stable. Yeah, and the signs of that are commodification, right? And that Simon and I talk a lot about, all right? It's one of the early signals. And if you also, and I'm going to be slightly cynical now, right? The way you know that something has reached the end of its life cycle is if IBM declare it to be strategic or Steve Denning writes a best-selling book about it. Those are actually both indicators of something is at the end of its days.
Okay, we're going to put this up on Vimeo, so just let's remember that.
Oh, well, they're fine with that. Yeah, I think what I was getting at is there's sort of different degrees of stability. So on the end where it's ripe for it's being overtaken by something is almost ossification. It is unable to adapt to anything. And then on the front end of that, you have a very fluid type of stability that opens other options for you. So as one of the thoughts on
that's the apex predator point. So once an apex predator is established in an ecosystem, they survive no matter how incompetent they are, until the ecosystem suffers traumatic change. Yeah, and then something small and energy efficient will take over. It's quite interesting. Of all the frameworks I presented at Rhode Island, and I see Trent's on the call, so he'll understand this. The Flexuous curves was the most appealing to naval strategy. Yeah, and if you haven't read Trent's book about the way that the Pacific strategy is pertained into the modern day uncarriers, you'll see exactly the same thing happens. Yeah, there are dominant patterns of the way people think, and strategic advantage is by understanding when you want to be on that curve just before your competitor. All right, and so I was fascinated. That was a big take up at Rhode Island and that was a whole bunch of admirals. Yeah. Slightly confused because Trump fired the head of the school in halfway through my speech, which made things a bit disruptive, but that's another story.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, I'll hit the final one. This is in the format. The reason I'm using Estuarine as a framework is, and I say this, and we're part of, we own a percentage of the flow companies as declaration of interest, and they use our methods. All right, that's Nigel Thurlow's group, and I think that's one of the better adoptions of lean. Right, we got an article coming out and all sorts of stuff, but I got really irritated with everybody assuming that flows are linear. And I've never liked constructional law, right? Because basically I don't think human systems follow the same patterns as tree roots, because actually we can break path dependency. We can do things differently. Yeah. So again, that's, I don't like that sort of quasi-determinism. So if you think about an estuary, the water flows in and it flows out. Tidal means that things will flow in different directions at different times of the day. You might have a granite cliff that you only need to survey every 20 years, or sandbanks you may need to survey every day, or dredge a channel. A lot of the time you've got to read the waters from the signs on the surface, but you can't fully know what's underneath it. And you also have this sort of salt marsh type tendency of the system, the estuary itself is constantly changing and adapting. So to me, an estuary is a really good metaphor for what we're dealing with human systems, and metaphors are important for sense making. Yeah. And that linked in with something I came across years ago at the Hay Festival. If you've never been to How the Light Gets In, and we're actually organizing a cognitive event around it this year, right? And it's finally back physically at Hay-on-Wye. Hay-on-Wye, if you don't know it, has got the world's largest collection of secondhand books. It's known as the town of books. And if you appear with a Kindle, it's likely to be taken out of your hands and broken, right? And it's an amazing place, all right? It's just on the Welsh side of the border, all right? And every year they have this massive 10-day book festival. And then they have a 4-day festival called How the Lights Gets In, where you meet scientists and philosophers and theologians. I mean, I spend all 4 days, and you might do 10 sessions in a day of 40 minutes of deep intellectual stimulation. And it's highly intimate, so you're intense with people and you can have conversations. This is the Intellectuals Pop Festival, and you do need Wellington boots if the water is bad, all right, in terms of the way it works. So either way, a lot of the stuff that you see comes from Hay. I've been at every one of those festivals. And you just wander around, and you can have a conversation with Rose, who's one of the leading biologists in the world, yeah, or Nobel Prize winning physicists. You can just have a conversation with them, right? And that's great. Right? So one of the things which I picked up on is a thing called constructor theory in physics. Now, this goes back to, effectively, it comes from Cambridge University, from David Deutscher. So it comes from quantum mechanics, less than thermodynamics, and that's significant. Quantum mechanics I've always been more interested in anyway, because it has this very high level of uncertainty. Yeah. Now, the way quantum mechanics, and so you got this, that Deutscher was initially there and Carla came in. Yeah. I'd read David rather than Carla. Carla has got herself on the speaker circuit now and is becoming world famous, and that's always a problem in terms of engagement. David's much more open. And they wanted to approach physics from the perspective of the whole system rather than atomistic perspective. So physics is traditionally trying to find the smallest and smallest of possible particles and project forwards for that. Yeah. I always thought we went as far as we could to go with quarks, but they've gone below that now. I like quarks, they come in threes. Right? So the idea is we need to see the system as a whole. So this is really picking up on a key concept from biology, that the properties of the system can't be described by the properties of the parts, which is also a complexity concept. So the way constructor theory does is it basically has 3 steps to it. And I'll tell you how we modified it in a minute. So the first thing is you identify the counterfactual statements. So for example, we know that the law of gravity isn't going to change. So that's a counterfactual. Right? So you start with a definition of what can't happen, not the definition of what could happen, and that creates your space. Then within that space, you identify constructors, and constructors, this is an older term which they picked up on used, and a constructor is producing replicable outcomes. So for example, a machine produces the same thing constantly. In human systems, something like ritual can produce completely consistent behavior. So you look for what are the constructors in play. And by the way, the reason a lot of people in physics are quite excited by this is it uses the concept of emergence for complexity to get rid of quantum uncertainty. So basically, you've got a pattern emerging which produces replicability. If it has evolutionary benefit, it persists. Yeah? And then within that, you basically say whatever has the lowest energy gradient will win. Okay? And the reason is evolution tends to reduce energy costs. So if you want this at a high level for human systems, if the energy cost of vice is lower than the energy cost of virtue, it doesn't matter how much you protest, people will sin. Anybody with teenage children knows this one, right? It doesn't matter what you admonish, right? You have to change the energy gradients. So we're now modifying that, and we're now starting to talk about it in public for the first time. So first of all, one of the things we developed within the EU field guide is the concept of constraint mapping. Now, the reason we did constraint mapping is nobody can do an objective situational assessment. Okay? Every time people do a situational assessment, they've got a subconscious concept of what they want to do. So they interpret the situation to match that intention. Yeah, and you might get the odd individual who doesn't do that, but it's so rare as to not be, you can't predicate a scalable model on the assumption of sainthood. Right? So you have to work with how people are, not how you would like them to be. So what we do is we deflect. So we say you map the constraints. So that's working indirectly. And then you identify, and we have a whole typology of constraints, and you identify the nature of the constraints and can you change them. And then you start the safe to fail probes within Cynefin would be constraint changes. So you might, for example, make a rigid constraint permeable. So that's kind of like one of the ways we feed into Cynefin is do the constraint map and then identify which changes to constraints might produce a better result and basically do the probes that way. Right? So this is a way of creating, and this is part of this whole process of objectifying abductive thinking in terms of the way it works. So what we now do is very simple. We start off by doing the constraint maps, and then we constraints. This is where I've changed in the concept of fixed constraints and enabling constraints to say certain type of constraints are counterfactuals, i.e. they can't be changed. And other constraints are constructors, they're producing replicable outcome, which is what Alicia talks about as an enabling constraint. So I do my constraint mapping to map the current counterfactual state and the current constructors. I then identify the temporality and energy cost of changing the counterfactuals. So if I've got a counterfactual, and this was the other stuff I talked about at Rhode Island in its early stages, if the cost of changing a counterfactual is higher than you can afford or will take longer than you have, then there's no point in talking about it. Now, this, by the way, fits in with an old adage on complexity. Yeah, what can I change? Out of the things that I can change, where can I monitor the impact of the change? And out of the things where I can monitor the impact, where could I amplify success or dampen failure? That's a really simple heuristic for complexity intervention. Yeah. Now, if we then look, we can then actually map that, right? So Cynefin's safe to fail probes then become attempts to stimulate the formation of constructors. Yeah, so if your probes individually or in combination create replicable outcome, you can reinforce that if it's desirable or disruptive if it isn't. Yeah. We can also be more proactive about that, and we've done this for years before I came across constructor theory, is we try and avoid the whole mission and goals and purpose statement. The whole purpose movement is, to my mind, just a con trick. It's just mission statements, you know, revisited. Yeah. There's only so many ways you can write platitudes on a flip chart, and all of these books are highly retrospective. If you read the purpose book, every single example is retrospective. It's repurposing history to match a thesis. Yeah, now that's kind of like a real problem with these books. The reality is, if you understand complexity, then you don't know what the future state is. So one of the ways we define a counterfactual, let's take the organizational change thing, is we start off by agreeing what we don't want to be as an organization. It's actually quite easy to get consensus for that. It's not easy to get consensus on what we do want to be. So that's another way that you define counterfactuals. And the way you create an easy, and that actually leaves open possibilities. I'll come back to fairy stories. Remember the stories you tell your children? Yeah, they're not about how, you know, Janet and John stayed at home, did what mummy and daddy said, achieved the family KPIs, and, you know, conform with the family purpose statement. I mean, can anybody imagine doing that with a bunch of kids? I satirized this in Dallas once, by the way, and I was in a bad mood anyway, because I've been taught, I was working with the Ebola management team, and I was told I couldn't talk about evolution because it was a controversial theory. So I was in a state of some distress around that, all right? Either way, right? I'll come on to that. And then I satirized the concept, you'd never do that with teenagers, and discovered there are consultants in Dallas who will come into your family and create a family mission statement and KPIs for your children. And that brings me into those whom the gods will destroy, they first send mad, right? So either way, so you wouldn't do that in practice. The reality is what we do is we share what doesn't work and we leave open possible pathways for our children. And that's actually quite a good way of directing a company. It also then means that you have to find novel or new ways of explaining what's in military terms is called commander's intent. I did a lot of work on this at Quantico and elsewhere with some 3-stars. Yeah. We actually worked on creating metaphor-based command languages in which in 3 or 4 words, you can explain a complex intent, which if people understand the stories you're using, they will understand, but you couldn't write it in less than 50 pages, but you can now say it in 4 words. I'll give you some examples of that later if you want. And we're now bringing that into the commercial line. So you use metaphor to indicate direction rather than using platitudes to define goals. Yeah? And then we can also, this is one thing SenseMaker is the next major release, which is out now, can do, is you map the energy gradients of the system to identify where people can change and where they're unlikely to change. And then you try and modify the energy gradient so that people are more likely to do good things than bad things. Yeah? Now that to me is actually quite, and it will have its own name, all right? So you've got constraints which produce constructors and counterfactuals. You've got ways of creating counterfactuals. You've got temporality, you've got energy cost and energy gradient. And the latest thing on that, which I was working on in Oxford University yesterday, and I'm limited in what I can say on this, is this gives us a whole new approach to foresight. Because now we don't try and forecast the future. We actually work on what the energy gradients are so we can make probability statements about which directions of travel we go in. And that really comes back to this fundamental principle of complexity theory, that we start journeys with a sense of direction. Okay? And if you recognize that, what's critical is you find ways to describe the present. So counterfactuals, constructions are one way. And one of the other ways which links into that, and I've got to do the integration yet, is we talk about agency, assemblage, and affordance. So you don't talk about people and things, you talk about what the affordances are within the environment, i.e. what things are possible. Well, counterfactuals does that. You talk about the assemblage structure, and remember for me, assemblages are strange attractors of tropes. So those are the narrative patterns which limit how people see the world. And you talk about what has agency in the system. Yeah, so you map affordance, assemblage, and agency, and some of that also comes out of the constructors. And then you look at that landscape, remember the Estuarine map? Yeah. And you say, what can I change? Out of the things that I can change, where can I monitor the impact of change? And where I can monitor the impact, where can I amplify or dampen? And then I have a whole system, continuous scanning. So as things start to change, I can rapidly move if things work or don't work. But if I've understood this temporality, I can actually focus my energy where it needs to be focused. I don't need to worry about the granite cliffs unless there's an earthquake, but I do need to worry about the sandbanks. And you can see how that also works in organizational culture. So that's very high level. To me, this is as exciting as Cynefin. It actually is a completely different approach to corporate strategy. And it's actually an ecological approach to corporate strategy rather than an engineering approach to corporate strategy, because it defines what's possible in the environment and makes you aware before your competitors about what you can actually do. And with that, I've finished. Open forum.
Wow. Okay, that was a lot.
Well, I did it in 3 sections.
Does anybody have any questions or comments? You can raise hands. If you don't want to be recorded, you can send it to me in the chat. I mean, this is really, I mean, what you're talking about here, Dave, is like a major shift in the approach to corporate strategy. I mean, this is going to take a lot of work, I think, to convince these people to come.
Yeah, but I'm doing it now. I've been playing around with it for 10 years. I'm doing it now because the old approaches to strategy have become very tired. Mm-hmm. We got the EU field guide, which is a significant risk reduction. So, for example, one of the things we're pushing out on the website again this week is an assessment of what you did during COVID against the field guide. Well, that's a risk-free project. In fact, we have a whole facilitation kit, which we can train you to use to do it, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, those are the sort of signs that people are about to shift. I mean, just to be really nasty about this, most pandemics take 3 years to feed through the system, if you look historically. Mm-hmm. So we got another 18 months to a year of this, yeah? And as I said some time ago, COVID is God's gift to humanity, something which a lot of people are copying without acknowledgement at the moment, right? Because actually we got worse to come. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are bacteria which are defrosting in Siberia at the moment, for which we haven't got antibiotics. So I think the sort of VUCA concept is now a universal, and the secret is to, and this is Brasso again, we're codifying at the right level of abstraction so we can get rapid diffusion. It doesn't take long for these to take off, you know, when you get them.
Yeah. Yeah, by the way, I highly recommend a paper called The 4 Black Deaths by Monica H. Green to give some perspective around some of what's happening right now. Tiani, you have
the other one I'd recommend if you haven't read it. This is the current one on my list, all right, which is...
Oh, yeah. Yay, team. Yeah, I'm reading that right now.
That fundamentally destroys the Enlightenment concept, which dominates Western thinking. Yeah, you're not going to believe in the hero's journey or any of that nonsense after you read that book. And the key thing it identifies is that there wasn't this agricultural shift, in that so-called primitive societies oscillated between hunter-gatherer and agricultural over quite an extended period. And they had very sophisticated distributed command structures.
Yeah. By the
Yeah,
way,
if,
just
but
as an aside to everyone, if you go to the Cynefin wiki, cynefin.io/wiki, there is like a research and reading lists and things like that, where a lot of the stuff that Dave mentions is listed for you. So you can find it all through the wiki. Go ahead, Jocko, I'm sorry.
oh, I was just going to say about 2/3 through that book, and it is very interesting in the fact that many of these adopted agriculture, and then as far as we know, by choice, left it, and then came back to it, and we see a lot of that in the kind of the mysterious stuff. But yeah, highly recommended book. Tiani,
Okay.
I believe, is
Tiani.
time to speak.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the last.
Dawn of everything. I mean, it's about 10 times as long as it needs to be. That's the pain of it.
Yes,
but it is actually based on some real scientific research, as opposed to that nonsense in what's the book? Hang on. Oh yeah, Sapiens.
Yeah.
I mean, Sapiens is a classic hype book. Yeah. I mean, it's so inaccurate in terms of history. It's hysterical that anybody could get away with it.
Yeah, I almost dropped that book after 2 chapters. Not that one, the one that you're referring to, the good one, because the first 2 chapters are a little bit iffy, but then it really takes off. So if you can get through
chapter 3 is where it really takes off.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Cool. Tiani.
Now let Tiani speak.
Thanks. So the last thing that you ended, one of the last things you ended on was an ecological approach to strategy, making you aware of what's possible in the environment, rather contrasting that with an engineering approach. And this is an interesting question because I'm actually working with some groups, I would say leadership groups in a very large organization, trying to figure out how to do strategy. They've done some mapping, which also connects me back to the question, what you mentioned around having the right analytical skill to actually create a map in the first place. And then maybe an analyst should do that. And then you use and execute or like walk through that map with their help somehow. That's something interesting. But how would you contrast the ecological approach to the engineering approach to go deeper on that a little bit?
Okay. So this allows me to get into my pet subjects. One of the things people complain bitterly about what they call scientific management, and they demonize it. Yeah. Now, actually, they're demonizing business process reengineering and Six Sigma, which came in the 80s, which comes out of systems dynamics. Yeah. And I had the privilege of teaching with Drucker. And the point Drucker and I both made in various forms was that actually scientific management and complexity theory have a lot in common, because they both require human judgment to be exercised. Whereas what we've had with the engineering approaches is progressive attempts to remove human judgment completely from the agenda. Yeah. And if you actually go back and bother to read Taylor, which very few people do, and you look at the historical context in which he was working, he was trying to humanize the workplace, for God's sake. Yeah, in a modern day, you might say a production line is bad, but God, you should have seen what they had before that, right? And what's also interesting is the whole 3-year, 5-year plan, the rigid targets all come in the 80s and 90s. They don't exist before then, right? And people expect to be in a company, at least the management, they serve their leadership. So they don't expect to do a BA in business studies, do an MBA at an elite American college. And by the way, you don't buy an education if you go to Harvard or Stanford, you buy a network. That's why it's so expensive. Yeah, and then join a big consultancy firm and then get parachuted sideways into an organization with no, what Aristotle called pronesis. They've got Sophia, but no pronesis. Yeah. And that just would not have been conceivable until the 90s and the introduction of engineering metaphors around systems dynamics. Yeah, which is when it took over. And you had the hard end with BPR and the soft end with learning organization, but it was all still MIT engineers when it comes down to it. Trent, you've got your hand up.
Trent, yeah, Trent's up next.
Sorry, I'm always interested on this one, so go for it, Trent.
Yeah, sure. So two things, Dave. One, I feel this way as well, but want to point out that some people have asked in the chat, you said that you can provide some examples of metaphor-based command language. So that's the first thing. But the question I have here, I really like the analogy, the metaphor of an estuary. I think that's quite powerful, especially with the way it brings in context. You said earlier that these sorts of frameworks need to be able to fit on the back of a napkin. And I'm struggling with this one. I don't know how you'd fit this one back on the back of a napkin. I'm curious about that. I'd like to hear you say more about that. And also, is there any sort of a visualization or drawing that goes along with this one at this point?
Yeah, I'm close, all right. And so some of the stuff I wouldn't put in a public forum yet. Yeah, particularly one which has competitors present. So I'll be cautious on this. So first of all, I've got a whole bunch of C charts all over the thing, and I've actually got manuals on how to create C charts. And I've gone back to some of the stuff on triangulation and the first map of New Zealand, all right? So it takes a long time to make something simple. You can make something complicated very quickly, right? So I can, to quote St. Paul in Corinthians, see as through a glass darkly. Yeah, but it's going to take a few more months, and I'm going to have to present it several times. I need to teach it in order to understand it. I never understand why academics don't want to teach. Until you teach, you haven't really understood anything, I don't think. Yeah. So yes, I think it's possible, and I think the Estuarine metaphor is it, and I think we can do that quite simply. We may end up with a table napkin model and something more like something which is more like a symbol-based map. So we're doing a lot of work on semiotics at the moment, and we're using semiotics for interpretation of data when we use sensor networks rather than just language, right? And if you don't know, we did a major project with the European Union. In fact, we got 4 or 5 going with them. But one of the big ones we did was to create meaning walls, by which you constantly encounter other people's narrative and other people's interpretation in almost random ways. And we have artists to reinterpret that. Yeah, and we're actually creating a business model by which if the artist's interpretation works, they get paid. Yeah, now that's got the foresight community hugely enthusiastic and the strategy community hugely enthusiastic, because it creates, and that's the Estuarine thing. Yeah, it creates that flexibility, and we can introduce semiotics or symbols to make that simpler. Right? If you want metaphor-based command language, I'll give you my favorite one, all right? So when I started to work for DARPA, after I discovered I was working for John Poindexter, and I didn't know who he was until I decided I liked him, and then it was too late, all right? And he's still a good friend. Yeah, and then they famously, I was in Arlington, and they said, what do you know about the Civil War? And I was, by that time, feeling mischievous. So I said, do you mean Stephen and Matilda or Charles and Cromwell? And they looked at me with this expression of horror. And thereafter, every meeting was held on a different Civil War battlefield. To the point, the American Civil War, that is, to the point where I've become obsessive. So I've done the Gettysburg Walk twice, all right? The 3-day one where you get taken around by somebody from each side and you see it from different perspectives, yeah? And there's only one Civil War battlefield I haven't been round now. And as you may know, when we did the work with the OODA loop at Quantico 2 years ago, myself and Dennis actually did a battlefield walk, which was fun because I was coming from a European perspective. And I don't think any American can be objective about the Civil War. I just don't think it's possible. Yeah. But that's a personal view, all right? If you haven't read it, all right, there's a wonderful book called, I've forgotten what its name's. I'll send it to you. It's actually a British historian who took the British and French embassy records and wrote the history of the Civil War from those, which is quite brilliant, all right? It's up there on my extensive bookshelves of Civil War stuff, right? Either way, so we came back to Gettysburg, and I'm now telling, we know this isn't accurate, but this is the story people tell about Gettysburg. That's the crazy thing, all right? When you get into this and you check the detail. So Gettysburg is an accidental battle. I'm in firmly of the camp that if Lee had planned it, he would have won. And it's an accident because he's lost his cavalry because Stuart has gone off to try and vindicate himself, so he hasn't got his scanning mechanism, and they encounter the army of the North, who would have run like hell if they knew Lee was that close, because McClellan didn't want to have a fight anyway. So it's a series of accidents, yeah? And if Lee had gone on day one at the cemetery, he would have won. Yeah, but he just didn't know the battlefield. So that's actually turning point number one. But turning point number two, the critical thing, is a battle on Little Round Top. All right, so if you ever go there, it's fascinating. And the way this popular story is told, it's not actually the truth, but it's the popular story, is that you have Chamberlain, who's an emergency trained officer from the Midwest, not from West Point. Yeah, most West Point graduates were in the South. And he takes a troop up to the top and he actually defends it. I mean, if you ever go up there, how the hell they did it, I don't know, because they had virtually no cover. They ran out of ammunition and then they do a bayonet charge. And it's the only successful Northern bayonet charge in the whole history of the bloody Civil War. But they win it. Now, if Lee had taken Little Round Top, he'd have had a commanding field of fire over the actual battlefield and also the reserve army of the Potomac. So battle over. Yeah. And if the South win Gettysburg, then Lincoln loses the election and you get a peace settlement. I mean, we spent a week playing with alternative histories of the US at Richmond, which was a lot of fun, right? So if I say Little Round Top, no Chamberlain, do you see what I'm doing? A Little Round Top, and what we do when we do this is we find a common understood situation or a fictional situation, and we identify counterfactual. This is a different use of counterfactual points. And that allows us to convey a very complex commander's intent in very simple words and to get better feedback. And I argue that Rhode Island, this is a bit like the Windjammer language. Yeah, because it's a language you have to have lived the stories to even understand. So I can now communicate in plain speech. Yeah, and I can switch between them. So that's an example. So if I'm doing it with a commercial organization and we're looking for beta test sites on this at the moment, what we do is we gather the common stories, the founder stories of that organization, which everybody knows, yeah? And then we put them into a structured form and make sure that everybody knows them backwards. And then we introduce counterfactual points where you can change things. And then that becomes, it's a way of communicating intent with what we call requisite ambiguity. Yeah, because if you try and convey intent without ambiguity, you can't cope with change. Yeah. Does that make sense or not? I've got one I'm playing with out of your Pacific book, by the way, but I haven't developed it yet. Yeah.
Oh, I was thinking, as you said, Little Round Top, no Chamberlain. There's lots of parallels that you could draw in more recent U.S. history that might be resonant with people who understand those things. As you say, it's a language that has to be read in on. You have to at least know, not necessarily the true history, but the stories that get told. And if you know the story, common. Yeah.
And Christian's got it right. It is actually in Star Trek: Next Generation. We used to use that episode on training courses. It's Darmon Kanjala that Tiagra is the communication in metaphor is far more economical. It uses far less energy, than explicit communication.
I think we have time for one more. Dave, you up for one more question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm relaxed.
Andrew, you're up.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have a background in physics, kind of before psych and cognitive science brought me into complexity and eventually consulting. So this idea of constraint mapping and constructor theory is really tantalizing. And I'm wondering if you can help me understand your definition of breaking path dependency and how that relate to Lorentz attractors, which, if anyone's unfamiliar with it, is kind of like that's the way the general space that chaotic systems tend to evolve into. And it's extremely sensitive to starting conditions and therefore path dependency. So I'm wondering if breaking path dependency is kind of moving through that Lorentz space, or if you're talking about something different.
Okay, but please come on these sessions again and ask more questions like that, all right? Because that's fun, right? My background's physics and philosophy, right? So that's where I come from, right? And theoretical physics, not any of that applied nonsense. I mean, my view is theoretical physics and philosophy, you can do or you can't do, so you don't have to work hard. Whereas engineers have to SWOT, right? So let's look at that. So first of all, I would, if you take Lorentz butterfly and treat it as a strange attractor, which is how it's generally used in complexity theory. So it's probably one of the best known phenomena, right? A strange attractor because it's bloody strange, right? So you don't get any repetition of path, but you get a pattern. So the argument I've made is that the strange attractor is also what Deleuze calls an assemblage. And assemblage theory is really starting to come strongly in social science at the moment, particularly in health. Now, I need to be careful here, and there's different definitions, and we're just about to publish a new ebook on narrative work, yeah? And 3 of my staff who know more about it than I do, including my daughter, who got a bloody thesis prize for talking about assemblage theory. So I'm very careful what I say, because they may pick up and I may get beaten up, all right? But an assemblage is, in narrative terms, is a pattern of micro-narratives which basically starts to clump and create an entrainment pattern. So, and it's one of the real dangers of things like Facebook. So Facebook clumps people together on the basis of hatred. And you don't survive as a politician unless you actually become an extremist. That's where Facebook has got us. And the irony is, I think the Chinese have actually got it right. They're actually having windows where kids can't go on the internet. Yeah, so that they don't get trapped into that particular environment, right? Which is a good example of a constraint. So what I famously said is that a strange attractor is an assemblage, is what in narrative theory is a trope. So nobody who understands this stuff would take the concept of meme seriously. That's a classic bit of Dawkins reductionism. But a trope is a dominant pattern over multiple micro-narratives, not a single narrative trying to replicate itself. So for me, a trope is an assemblage, yeah, is a strange attractor. Yeah? And that then allows me to take one of the key concepts from D&G, yeah, which is what's called a line of flight. So if I've got an assemblage, I have to find a weakness in the system which allows me to escape from it. Yeah, I can't just say I want to be somewhere different, because I can't do that. And that's where I'm experimenting with this concept of entanglement around different timelines. Because if you can increase the empathetic contact between people and people, you get there. And so I had a major row on this with some of the classic political fixers in the States on the work we're doing at the moment, because I said, I mean, for example, in the last election in the States, the far right or the Russians or somebody, I mean, we'll never really know, was actually deliberately telling believable lies to family groups the day before they voted. You got that level of targeting at the moment, right? And people are saying we need to make people aware of this and we need to counter it. And I'm saying, well, you can't, because you'll never win that. What you've got to increase is the human-on-human contact, so that they can't believe that sort of pernicious lie. So you've got to increase the physicality or the empathetic connections between people. And so, I mean, back in the 70s, and I've just taken a fellowship at the Carter School at one of the Washington universities to work on this, yeah, which is a new approach to peace and reconciliation. So back in Northern Ireland in the 70s, when I was working there, there were 2 approaches to peace and reconciliation. One was Coromila, which was a classic Enlightenment idea. And you find this in what I call Boston Brahmins, who I've come to intensely dislike Boston Brahmins, in that they believe if everybody came into a workshop and they facilitate it and they explain to people why you should be nice to each other, the world would be a better place. This is the fundamental principle of neo-colonialist ideas like, Theory U and the like, right? Now that was wonderfully satirized. If you haven't seen it, I'll give you the clip there, in one of the great comedies which has come out of Britain recently called Derry Girls, in which the Catholic girls are forced into a peace and reconciliation process with the Protestant boys led by a trendy priest and managed by a cynical nun, all right? So I leave you with that to watch. It takes about 4 or 5 minutes and it's certainly funny. I was then working with the Jesuits. I was a Jesuit postulant. We took a different approach. We took small groups of people from both communities and we dumped them into Latin America for 6 months. And they suddenly discovered they had a lot more in common than they thought. And we allowed them to have a conversation about their religious differences when they were ready to have it. It didn't have to be facilitated. Yeah. And this is what I'm also talking on the indigenous communities. It moves from talk in order to act in order to talk. And that's kind of like one of the big post-Enlightenment switches. Yeah. So what we're looking at the next stage of the P&R program in the States is children's ethnographers identify problems which are common to blue and red alike, and then get people from blue and red to work on micro problems at a local level, where they're working on something where they're all agreed it's a problem and they can find a solution together, and let them have the conversation about the political differences later. And that's about creating micro-human empathetic contact in order to break the path dependency of the assemblage structures. And we're also looking at software ways to do that as well.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good application for Paulo Freire's praxis theory. Are you looking at the?
I'm a child of the 70s. I mean, I teach just war theory at West Point every now and then, and I use Catholic Marxist textbooks from the 70s because we had to justify, shooting the bastards come the revolution. So we went back to Aquinas, all right? So yeah, I mean, and there's an old phrase we have from the 70s, practice makes perfect. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, we all owe a huge debt to Freire. Yeah, but I think it's like, I think we owe a huge debt to Stafford Beer as well. But he'd never have created the VSM model if he knew about complexity theory. Yeah, and we all owe a huge debt to Jung, right? But Jung's theories are incoherent with what we now know about cognitive neuroscience. So there's times when we need to move on, right? And I think that's important. So I with all homage to Freire, I think we know more about praxis now than we did in his days, but he's still inspirational.
Okay, anyone else? Going once? Going twice? Okay.
So, Barbara.
Oh,
I do have something. So, Dave, it occurred to me that one reason the metaphor-driven approach might resonate with some of those people in Rhode Island is they've got that in their fabric. Don't give up the ship.
Mm-hmm.
It's James Lawrence's admonition, and it ends up on Oliver Hazard Perry's battle flag. It's right there.
I think Navy. I mean, Navy always get it. I mean, they're not a bunch of flyboys. Yeah. Navy pilots are very different. All right. How the hell they take off? How the hell they land on a carrier in a storm? I'll never understand. It's a bloody miracle. All right. But basically, the Navy concept is autonomous distributed command in alien environments. And you can never fully know everything, right? And so I think they get it much faster than the people. And the Marines are the same, by the way. Quantico is, and I thoroughly enjoy lecturing at Quantico. Yeah? And the most precious thing they gave me, actually, last time I was there, still treasure this, which is... That's stand from Io Jimbo.
Oh yeah,
yeah, which is kind of like sacred soil for the Marines, right? So I think and Marines do a lot of very innovative stuff in the States. And if you really want to understand innovation in business, start with military. Yeah, and then look at how you move that stuff across. You don't move, and everybody gets this wrong. They basically say a military model is command and control. It's bloody nonsense. I mean, a weapons sergeant has authority over a brigadier if it comes down to the weapon. Military environments know how to distribute command. Yeah, and I think that's where we get a lot of ideas from.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else before we head on out? Going once, going twice. Okay. Well, Dave, this was awesome. We can't thank you enough for joining us today and taking time out of your busy schedule and giving us so much to think about and so much to read. Please come back whenever you like. Maybe Ellie will join you sometime. You are always welcome. And we couldn't have asked for a better ending to this, our first year of virtual meetups. And thanks to all of you. We started this meetup to find other people as interested in complexity as we were, and we are grateful and amazed that all of you show up each month. Once again, thank you, Dave, and whatever y'all celebrate, have a festive holiday season. Thank you.